Well, welcome to the second in our series this morning called Headstrong. We are looking at the question of how we defeat the giant challenge in our culture today that is emotional well-being. How do we manage the challenges of 21st century life? And not just survive them, but how do we thrive in the midst of some of those challenges? This is part of our year in 29 at Zio, looking at some of the giants of life and living and our world, and looking at what blessings it is that God has given us to help us to defeat those things. So we are looking at giants of emotional health. Last week, we looked at anxiety. How do we defeat the giant of anxiety and fear? This week, we are looking at joyful. Now, let me just reassure you, we are not looking to defeat the giant of joy. If anyone's concerned about this, no, that's not what we're doing. We're not saying we're going to remove all joy from your life. It's the other way round, because we live in challenging times right now, don't we? There's a lot going on. I don't know about you. I think I said last week, but I've started to stop listening to the news in the morning because it just makes me grumpy. Does anybody else find that? It's quite alarming. There's so much going on. It never feels very positive. We hear lots of worrying stuff on the news these days. The challenge of austerity, political turmoil, the threats of things like climate change. It can all feel a bit depressing. And we know as well that some of the challenges of 21st century living are affecting people of all ages, but particularly the rising generations. And many of you will know that by background, I'm a psychologist. I work with an organization when I'm not here, which is looking at the challenge of emotional health. And we hear statistic after statistic after statistic showing the rise in levels of emotional distress and challenge. And even in the last week, I had 2 conversations with people who've been involved in doing patches of research, looking at specific groups, one with students, one in a school setting. And both of those people were phoning me in quite a panic, saying that the results of their studies had shown more than 90% of the people they were surveying were reporting significant levels of emotional distress. 90%. That's 9 out of 10 of the students in the study that was looking at students. 9 out of 10 of the teenagers in the one that was looking at a school population. So actually the challenge of emotional distress and ill health is absolutely everywhere. And it's an interesting question how we challenge that. You know, as one of her last acts as Prime Minister, because as one of my kids asked me this week, they said, but who actually is running the country at the moment? I'm like, you know what, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure anyone is, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing. Who knows? But as one of her last acts as Prime Minister, Theresa May pledged a new mental health awareness campaign that is coming in the autumn, probably because nothing's certain, but that's going to be called Every Mind Matters, and it's supposed to be to raise awareness of emotional ill health and mental health as a challenge. But you know what? I would say to you as someone working in this field, I think awareness is not our challenge. I think we are much more aware than we used to be, certainly than a decade ago. But as we're talking so much more about mental illness, I think another challenge presents itself to us, which is, are we talking enough about wellness? Because that's actually the thing we're aiming at. This is a quote from the American philosopher Henry Thoreau, which says, "Never look back unless you're planning to go that way." You know, it's a basic truth, isn't it, that we focus our eyes on the thing that we want, the thing that we're aiming at. And yet, how much do we talk about the good stuff of life, the good stuff of emotional health? How much do we talk about wellness and things like happiness and joy? Because that's what we want for us, for our kids, for our teenagers and young people. We need more joy. We need more health. We need to learn how to be happy. How do you manage the challenges of life? How do you bounce back when life is throwing rubbish at you? And so this morning, I want us to spend some time thinking about joy. How do we live joy-filled lives? Because this is something we could all use more of. How do we do it? So before we move any more into that, we need to think about, well, what actually is joy? So here are a few definitions. This is a definition from the American Psychological Association of joy. It is a feeling of extreme gladness, delight, or exaltation of the spirit. Joy is a good thing. Here's another definition. It says that joy is an emotion comprised of feelings of happiness, contentment, and harmony. That sounds good, doesn't it? Who would like this afternoon to spend the afternoon bathed in feelings of happiness, contentment, and harmony? Yeah, that sounds good, doesn't it? It's my prayer for my family this afternoon. Happiness, contentment, harmony. I shall tell them that after the service. But this definition continues to make an interesting observation about joy, and it's this. It says, joy differs from general happiness in that it is not caused by a particular event, but comes from within the individual. So it's interesting to understand when we're talking about joy of how this differs from happiness. Happiness is a shorter term emotion that's triggered by something that happens and you feel happy. Joy, though, has this sense that it's a longer term state. It's something less transitory. And it comes from somewhere within. Many definitions of joy, interestingly, talk about it as a spiritual thing. It's something to do with the connectedness that we have with ourselves, with nature, with higher being, whatever that is that you believe in. There's a sense that joy has this mysterious quality that we perhaps find really hard to describe and to understand. And interestingly, the Bible talks a lot more about joy than it does happiness. If you want to go away and Google it later on, you'll find that there are around, depending on which translations you look at, 400 references to joy in the Bible. There's actually only around 20 or so for happiness. So there's something about this sense of joy that we need to understand, that we need to harness this morning. Something about something that is a longer term thing. It's not fleeting. It's not short term. You try and grab hold of it, but it's gone. It's like a baseline, foundational thing that you can build your life on and around. And it's an interesting thing for us to think about in terms of how the Bible talks about it. Here's one of the most common quotes that you might have heard from the Bible. This is from the Old Testament talking about joy. How many people have heard this quoted? The joy of the Lord is your strength. How many people have heard that quoted? Yeah. How many people have had that quoted at you when you are feeling really crabby? Yeah. Yeah, a couple of you. It's not always the most helpful thing. How many of you have felt like mildly thumping someone who has said that? No, perhaps don't own up to it. The joy of the Lord is your strength. It's interesting for us as people of faith, as people who have a relationship with God, to think, what's the relationship for joy and our faith? And what's the impact that has on us? I love this verse, but I love the true depth of what it actually says in the original ancient Hebrew. That word that's translated as strength literally means it is your fortress, your safety, your place of protection. So we know that joy is a feel-good, happy emotion, but the Bible suggests to us that it's more than that there is something about this foundational joy that we can carry, that as human beings we're designed to carry, that is a protection, a place of safety for us as we enter more challenging times when life throws its difficulties at us. Joy is essential not just because of some hedonistic, feel-good lifestyle desire that we have. Joy is important because it sustains us. It helps us to be resilient. It helps us release the full potential of life that God so longs for us to have. Because life is inevitably hard sometimes, isn't it? It isn't, no matter what I say to you here, I am never going to be able to present something clever enough to tell you how to eradicate all difficulty and challenge from your life. So we need to understand what joy really is and how it can sustain us. Here's another ancient Hebrew piece of wisdom. This is from Proverbs in the Old Testament in the Bible. It says, more than anything you guard, protect your mind because life flows from it. Did you know that your mind is the center of everything that you are? We take our emotional well-being for granted far too often because if you struggle with your mind, with your emotional health, it affects everything else in your life. Protect and guard your mind more than anything else. So might joy be an essential part of our toolkit as we try and do that? If the Bible says that joy is our fortress, our place of safety, do we need to learn more and get better at pursuing joy, at prioritizing our experience of this ethereal, difficult to describe quality, this feeling? Because it has an essential pattern in the blueprint of how God creates us. So what I want to do this morning is spend some time looking at joy, and I want to look at 3 different types of joy that the Bible talks about. And for us all to think about, how do we do that? How do we pursue joy? How do we prioritize joy? How do we get more joy in life? How does that sound? Okay, well, fine, then we won't bother. I'll just go sit down. It sounds good, yes? We would like some more joy. So let me tell you about these 3 types. Now, the first one then is another ancient Hebrew word for joy. You can see it on the screen. This is one example of its use in Psalm 16, verse 11, when the Psalms are ancient songs that were written to God, songs of celebration, songs from all kinds of different emotion. But this is one that's where the psalmist, the writer, is saying to God, "You will fill me with joy." Now, this joy is literally just joy. It is the basic sort of emotional quality, very linked to happiness, of joy, that feel-good moment that we have. Now, I wonder how joyful you feel you are as a person, because people vary, don't they? We all know some people who are a bit like Snoopy. Who used to like Snoopy cartoons, or who still does? Yeah, who still has the collection of those old Snoopy books on their shelves? Okay, that's just me then, right? Let's move on from there. But remember Snoopy? He's always skipping along, isn't he? Little ears flopping. He is basically a joyful character. Some people are more naturally joyful than others, and you may be sitting here thinking, well, I'm just not designed that way. I'm just not a very joyful person. Maybe some of you are sitting thinking about significant others in your life thinking, yeah, they are just not very joyful people. Now, interestingly, did you know that research into joy and happiness would suggest that about half of your levels of happiness and joy are defined by your genetics, your personality? So you are correct that there is some variation. In general, there's a variation in how expressive we are emotionally with all of our emotions, but there is a bit of a variation in terms of how naturally joyful you are. On top of that, some of you may be thinking, right, to be honest, Kate, you're irritating me right now because I've had a rubbish week. And if you knew what life was throwing at me right now, you would not be stood up there having a go at me about being more full of joy. Now, just to be clear, that's not what I'm doing. So let's hope you're not really irritated with me by now. But it's true that there are times in life where it's really hard to feel joyful. It feels like a flipping hard slog. And about 10% of your joy and happiness levels is affected or defined by what life is throwing at you right now. For some of you right now, it might feel like a lot more than 10%. But those of you who've been doing the maths will have calculated that that leaves 40% of your lateral levels of joy and happiness that are controlled by something else. So what is that? And research shows that it is actually about decisions that you make, choices that you make, the way you choose to live your life. So you can literally pursue joy. You can make decisions to change the way you live so you have more of this emotion in your life. This is a quote from a chap called Donald Altman. He is a psychotherapist, an expert in joy, and he wrote this book called The Joy Compass, which is about how you have more in your life. And he says, being in a state of joy is a learned skill, not an innate ability. So the good news is your joy levels aren't fixed. If you are sat here thinking the trouble is I'm just not a very joyful person, there's hope for you. We can change that. You can learn how to build more joy into your life. You can change your joy levels. And we all have to learn this. As kids, we have to learn what stuff do we enjoy? What stuff don't we enjoy? You know, the summer holidays are coming, parents. Beware for the inevitable cry from your children. What is it? I'm bored. And it's tempting for us to feel as parents we have to fill every moment of their life. But actually, boredom, research shows, is good for your kids because it forces them to find out, what do they enjoy? How do you fill time in a meaningful way that makes you happy? And your kids, it is their job to explore that. So next, when they come, parents, to you in the holidays and they say that, you can officially tell them that I said that this is good for them to be bored, to go and find some stuff to do, preferably not what my son did the other week, bring a football through the shed window. Although that did bring some joy, mostly to his sister, who thought he might get into trouble for it. But anyway, we should be learning how to be more joyful. We definitely shouldn't be passive. It's so easy just to treat these things as things that you either have or you don't. And if I'm just not very joyful, then that's just my bad luck. Because there is something that you can do about it. We need to seek joy out. Particularly those of us who are of a certain age. Gary, I don't know if we can flick this graph up. Now, this is a graph to show average levels of life satisfaction and joy over the course of your life. The bottom axis is your age. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Did you know small children, it's debated how often, but small children laugh hundreds of times a day on average. Adults, so I did a little bit of research on this because it is quite debated, but most studies suggest that the average adult laughs somewhere between 10 and 15 times a day. Some of you are like, seriously? I am more grumpy than I thought. But we do know that life throws challenges at us in all seriousness. Some of us are in phases of life where joy is a lot harder to find. You know, there are times in life where the responsibilities that you have, the chores that you have, the demands that are placed on you can literally start to squeeze joy out of your life. And this is recognized if you are in, like some of us are, Matt, bad luck, isn't it? Your mid-40s. Some of us are more mid than others though, right? Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Then this is statistically one of the most challenging parts of your life. It's going to get better, people. That's all I have to say. Once you're past 50, all you happy retired folk out there, honestly, yeah. Because there's this phase in life where you have so much responsibility. You still have young children. A lot of us also have elderly parents we might be caring for. In your job, research talks about how you have enough responsibility to really carry stuff, but you're not senior enough to be the person who basically tells someone else to do it all yet. That comes next, presumably. I'm looking forward to that, Matt. That's going to be good. But it can be challenging. I love, this is a comment from Dan Kopf, he's a journalist who says this: life starts well and ends well, the middle often stinks. So extra prayers for you today if you're in that place. But joking aside, it's true, this is hard. You know, I'm in that life stage. It's tough, juggling all the things that we have to juggle sometimes, and the worries and the challenges that life brings. And so often, you know, we play on the edge of burnout. We hear people talk about burnout all the time. You know, it's not unusual in a week for me to think, this is it. This is how I'm going to have my breakdown right now, this moment, because of that child or that traffic jam or whatever it is that's just broken or gone wrong. We play on the edge of it because we know that we're near the limits just because of what life is throwing at us. But we tend to think as long as we've not gone over the edge, we're okay. But Matt and the team and I, we were at a conference the other week where we were hearing from Carrie Newhoff. He's a Canadian church leader, and he was talking about the challenge of burnout and stress. And he was talking about what he calls low-level burnout. You can see his definition on the screen, where the functions of life continue, but the joy of life has gone. What a tragedy that is. If we accept as normal that for such a significant part of our lives, that will be our experience. Because the problem with external sources of joy is that they are external. They're often not under our control, and it can get squeezed out. So I'm going to ask you three significant questions that I want you to take away and ponder this afternoon in that happy, content space that you're obviously going to have this afternoon. And here's the first one. What is it that brings joy to your heart? What did you used to do that you don't do now because you don't have time. Because we say we don't have time. Really what we mean is we don't make time. And I know that's tough. It might require prioritizing some stuff, juggling something, making some changes. But you need joy in your life. What brings joy to your heart? Some of you may need to experiment because you don't even know. I don't know. It's so long since I felt joyful. I need to try some stuff out. Some of you have had such a challenging time in life that you find things that used to bring you joy just don't work anymore, so you've given up trying. We need to get back into the habit of trying, of deliberately building things into your life. Carrie, in his talk at the conference we were at, said this great question. He said, when did you last really laugh? Really belly laugh, like till tears come down your cheeks? Gosh, that's a hard question for some of us because we're in this adult phase. What brings joy to your life? But what I want to carry on to think about is some other sources of joy, because this is a great type of joy. But the challenge is it is fleeting. It is so easily pushed out. We need something better. We need an ultimate source of joy. And the Bible talks about an ultimate source of joy. This is Psalm 4, verse 7, talking about the joy that comes from God, that comes from a relationship with God. The joy that you have given me is more than they will ever have. With all those things in life that we try to use to make us feel good. Here it talks about two classics, food and wine. A lot of people will use those to try and get joy, but it's fleeting, it's temporary. The Bible talks about a source of joy that is deeper, that is more satisfying, that is more reliable than that. And that's the two extra things that I want to talk to you about now. So number 2 in my types of joy, this is actually a Greek word. It's from the New Testament. And it talks about joy. It's got the same root, this Greek word, as the word for grace. Grace is when we talk about the favor, the generosity that God gives us, the things that God has done for us, even though we could never earn it. And this type of joy is the joy that we feel when we have a moment of just being so aware of how blessed we are by the God who loves us that much. Did you know that God loves you that much? Did you know that there is a God who smiles on you? In fact, the Bible says that he rejoices over you with singing. I love that it's an Old Testament quote, that the Hebrew word that says rejoice, literally it means that he makes like a little exultation. It's like, whoop! He loves it. He's like, woohoo, when he thinks of you. God rejoices over you and he places that blessing in your life. So much of life can feel like a hard slog, can't it? But we don't have to earn the love and the favor that we have with God. That's a gift to him from us. That's what grace is. It's a gift. And the joy of those moments when you just recognize and remember and your attention is drawn to that gift from God. That's an amazing type of joy. One of the amazing things about it is that it is also present when life itself is throwing tough stuff at you. Here's a verse from the Old Testament, right back in Genesis, the first book in the Bible, talking about a guy called Joseph, that you will have all heard of him, if not through the Bible, from Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. The story of Joseph is one where he struggles for a long time in his life with real challenges. And this is a verse talking about a time when Joseph was in prison. He thought it was all over. He thought he was probably going to be killed. That he must have felt there was no hope for him. But this verse says that when he was in that dark place in the prison, the Lord was with him and showed him his faithful love. This type of joy, the awareness of God's love smiling down on you like the warmth of the sun yesterday, is a type of joy that can be present even when life is throwing real rubbish and challenges at you. But you have to be looking for it. You have to have radar for it. We can be so busy that we miss it. So my second question to you this morning is, do you have the time to spot the blessings in your life? And do you take the time when you spot one just to linger on it for a moment? Psychology talks about the art of something called savoring. That is where you stop and really deliberately take a moment to allow your attention to focus on something. So the next time you see something and you're aware of just that little flicker of something that is this type of joy, pause, take a moment. Maybe it's something from nature, a beautiful flower, the warmth of the sun on your back, the gentle noise of the breeze coming through the trees. Maybe it's something else, a literal blessing that God's placed in your life, a hug with one of your kids or the kid of a friend, somebody who sent you a friendly text in a moment that you were feeling really rough. I don't know what it is. The chance to have a quiet cup of coffee, to read the paper. One of these little blessings that life can give you, even in the midst of turmoil. Pause. Reflect on it. Because that's an amazing source of joy. That's number 2. Number 3 then, this morning, is another word for joy that comes from the Greek from the New Testament. I love this one. So we've just talked about the joy that comes from understanding God smiling on us, God's grace and mercy to us. This one is a joy that comes from having a different perspective on the world. And it's a perspective of understanding something so crucial right now where we're at in the world and our culture. And it is this: God is in control. He actually is in control. Even when it feels like he isn't and we are all in big trouble, God is in control. There is a higher power, a bigger story arc over humankind than just who is going to become the next prime minister of this country or climate change or any of those other things. God is in control. This Greek word is actually originally it's a sporting term, and it means to celebrate a victory. So those of you who are football supporters, anyone who watched the England women's team, there's a few of us, yeah. So a great victory to celebrate there. That's the type of joy that this word means when you celebrate a victory. And it is about celebrating a bigger victory over the whole of the history of humankind, and that we know that actually God has got a solution that is good, an ending that is good for people. He has a plan and he is in control. And the great thing about this type of joy is that it's something that we come to know when this verse says, "You have shown me the way of life." Literally that means that you have gradually developed my knowledge and understanding of this great truth. We get better at understanding this joy. You can grow and get more and more of it. And as it says in this verse, it can fill you. Not just a fleeting thing, but something that fills you to the brim. A type of joy that becomes so powerful that you feel full of it. It's the dominant thing that you're experiencing. And we need that, don't we? We need that sense of joy. Because did you know that your brain actually has a negative bias? This is a great verse from a guy called Paul in the New Testament, one of his many bits of great advice for how to live your life. He says this: summing it up, friends, I'd say you'll do best by filling your minds and meditating on things that are true, noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious, the best, not the worst, the beautiful, not the ugly, things to praise, not things to curse. Your brain is biased to focus and obsess on negative things because they're the important things, generally, you need to not repeat or not have in your life or deal with. In order to balance that natural bias, we need to intentionally and deliberately take time to focus and meditate on things that are good, that are better. And God's victory over the world is an amazing thing to spend some time focusing on, praying through, giving your attention to, instead of the attention-grabbing stuff that you see and read every time you look at the news. And the reason is because that can make all the difference to something that is so pervasive in our current culture, which is cynicism. Do you know the growth and the rise of cynicism in our culture as a personality trait that affects almost whole countries and whole generations of people? It's something that's being noted again by psychologists. And this type of joy from a better perspective is the ultimate solution to that cynicism. It changes anything. There's a character in the Old Testament called Abraham. He's one of the ancient fathers of God's people in the Old Testament. And his story is an amazing one because Abraham is told that he is going to become the father of all nations. The slight problem is Abraham has no children and he's old. He's very old. So it feels unlikely. And the story carries on that he basically gets older and he still has no children, and he gets older and he still has no children. And Abraham is in this place where God has promised something amazing, but all the human evidence would seem that it's not going to happen. And there's this great verse in one of the New Testament books that talks about what Abraham managed to do in that moment that was so clever. And it says this, that even when there was no reason to hope, Abraham went on hoping. That's what the joy of having God's perspective does. Even when the world's perspective looks rubbish, we can hold on to something positive. We can hold on to hope. We can defeat cynicism. And we can say, no, we are going to put our minds on something positive. So my question 3 for you this morning of 3 is this one. How do you nurture hope instead of cynicism? It's so easy to get drawn into our world's cynical culture of negativity, to snipe at one another, to make negative jokes. But how do we carry something ultimately so much more precious, hope and joy and things that can sustain us? So we've talked about 3 types of joy, a basic form, but then 2 more very important sources of joy that come from an understanding of who God is. And more than that, a personal relationship that we can have with the God who can give us this amazing new perspective. And the thing is, those 2 types of joy can change everything for us. Look at this, the last quote that I'm going to share with you today. This is from another guy in the New Testament called Peter. And he's writing about the impact that that relationship with God can have for us on our joy. And it's utterly mind-blowing. And he says this, he's talking to a bunch of earlier, relatively new Christians. He says, you love him, even though you've never seen him literally in the flesh. Though you do not see him, you trust him. And you rejoice with a glorious, inexpressible joy. Not just joy, not just fleeting happiness, not just the feel-good that comes from a beer on a hot summer's day or having a laugh with some friends. Good human stuff. What he's talking about here is something much more significant, a joy that sustains us right from the core of who we are, that fills us completely, that is our defense and protection against the rubbish that life throws at us, that is so powerful. It's inexpressible.